Now, while the Synod of Dort was going on, a crisis was breaking out in Europe. During the late 1500s, the Austrian Habsburg Empire reversed its policy of toleration toward Protestants. You'll recall that Protestants had been making significant strides in Central and Eastern Europe, and that they had been tolerated in the Habsburg lands here that are the Austrian Habsburg lands are in pink or purple there. Although the Habsburgs avoided violence, they began asserting strong pressure on the nobility, using every tool they had to cajole Protestant nobility back into the Catholic fold. And based on this concerted pressure over several decades, they were fairly successful. They also put pressure on the Hussite Church in Bohemia here, threatening privileges that the Hussite Church had held since the late Middle Ages for more than 2 centuries. So in 1618, Bohemia rose up in rebellion, famously throwing Habsburg representatives out of a tower window in the famous defenestration of Prague. You can still go see the tower today. And then Bohemia looked for a new king. Many Reformed Christians at this time believed that history was surely nearing its end, that Christ's return must be imminent, and they sought a hero to lead the next phase of Reformed progress. And a popular candidate was this man, Frederick V, the elector of the Palatinate. The Palatinate is this area over here, where you see it says Palatinate. Now, Frederick happened to be married to the daughter of King James of England, whose name was Elizabeth. So he was a prominent person. Bohemia invited Frederick to serve as its king, and he accepted. While this was happening, the reformed Prince of Transylvania, again, Transylvania is way over here, the reformed Prince of Transylvania named Gabor Bethlen, who saw himself as a new King David, conquered Habsburg-occupied Hungary, and the provincial estates of Inner Austria rebelled. So you have rebellion going on in Prague, getting the leader of the Palatinate to come help them. You have rebellions going on in this part of Hungary and in Inner Austria over here. Frederick traveled to Prague, where he recklessly began a process of reforming the Hussite Church. He wanted to turn the Hussite Church into a Reformed church. And this greatly dismayed the very Hussite leaders who had asked him to come be their king. At the same time, if Bohemia became fully Protestant, the balance of power in the Holy Roman Empire would shift toward Protestantism. The Holy Roman Empire, note, is all the area inside this red line, so it overlaps with the Habsburg lands. So Catholics feared that if Frederick got his way in Bohemia, it would shift the balance of power in the Holy Roman Empire toward Protestantism, and the Habsburgs could not allow this. So they invaded Bohemia, and they crushed Frederick's forces at the Battle of White Mountain. Then they paid off Prince Bethlen of Transylvania, and then, with support from Catholic Spain, they conquered the Palatinate. And they sacked Heidelberg in 1622. Now remember, I said that since Calvin died, the Palatinate had really become the center of the Reformed tradition on the continent. And so when Catholic Spanish forces are sacking the Palatinate, this is a huge blow to the Reformed cause. The Habsburgs, and then at the same time, remember that the Netherlands had been fighting for its independence from Spain and had finally won it, but only tentatively. There had been a truce known as the 12 Years' Truce established. But at this time, the 12-year truce expired, and so now the Netherlands was brought into the war. And so quickly, this is becoming a European-wide war. The Habsburgs began dismantling Protestant churches, and they launched a brutal re-Catholicization process in Bohemia, destroying the Hussite Church. The emperor expelled Protestant landowners from Inner Austria, and many, to escape persecution, converted to Catholicism. And then the Habsburg emperor turned to Germany, banning Reformed Protestantism and decreeing that all bishoprics and lands that had been seized from the Catholic Church since 1552, more than 70 years earlier, be returned to the Catholic Church. So the Habsburgs are launching a strong offensive against Protestantism in their lands. But this last move proved a bridge too far. Until now, the Lutheran princes of Germany had failed to unite with the Reformed. They did not identify with what Frederick was trying to do in Bohemia or with what Transylvania was trying to do. But now that the Habsburgs are trying to overrun so many Protestant areas, the Lutherans rally to the Reformed cause, and in 1630 they form an alliance. Lutheran Sweden intervened on the Protestant side, and surprisingly, even Catholic France. Obviously, you would expect Catholic France to fight on the Habsburg side if it was simply about religion, but France was worried at Habsburg power growing too strong. And here's a clear case of political motivations trumping religious motivations. The war spread, and it was marked by unprecedented brutality. For example, a Habsburg army sacked the Protestant city of Magdeburg in 1631 and killed almost all of its 20,000 inhabitants. It's estimated that over the course of the whole war, known as the 30 Years' War, as many as 8 million people died, which was as much as 40% of the German population, making this by far the biggest war in European history before the World Wars. And the Protestant cause was in crisis. Thousands of Protestant volunteers from England went to fight on the continent, and English Protestants expected James to intervene in the war, especially since his own daughter was married to Frederick. But James not only refused to intervene, he entered into negotiations to marry his son and heir, Charles, to a Catholic princess. Charles, his son, became King of England in 1625, and for all of James's faults, James had had a level of moderation and wisdom that Charles abandoned. Charles ended up marrying a French Catholic princess who was soon holding the Catholic Mass in the royal palace in England. Charles advanced Arminian bishops, including William Laud, who would become Archbishop of Canterbury. And his bishops imprisoned non-conforming bishops and clergy and hauled them before ecclesiastical courts. They introduced liturgical reforms that many Protestants found moving more and more in a Catholic direction. And on top of all that, Charles tried to rule England without Parliament. The foundation of English liberties, going all the way back to the Magna Carta in 1215, stated that the king could only raise taxes with the people's consent. Yet Parliament would not give Charles the taxes he wanted, so Charles tried to raise taxes without Parliament's consent, and when Parliament resisted, he imprisoned some of its members. So you can see how the Reformed cause and the concern for English liberties and the parliamentary cause end up coming together and sharing many concerns about Charles. As the Reformed cause staggered from blow after blow, Puritans became convinced that God was judging Christendom. It was obvious, it seemed, that he was judging Christendom on the continent. The 30 Years' War was tearing Europe apart, and many Puritans especially feared that England would be next. Many Protestants feared that the king intended to return England to Catholicism. And Parliament actively opposed his policies, both when it came to taxation and when it came to religion. So in 1629, the king dismissed Parliament. He, like his father James, believed in the divine right of kings. And from now on, he intended to rule for himself without Parliament. And it was starting that year that hundreds, and eventually thousands of Puritans began fleeing England and migrating to America. And we'll pick up that theme in the next lecture. Others went to the Netherlands, Ireland, or the West Indies. But during the 1530s, those Puritans who stayed, many of them, increasingly more and more pastors, lost their pulpits, or faced imprisonment, or even mutilation. In 1637, Charles began imposing similar policies on the Scottish Church, which you'll recall had been broadly reformed for quite some time. and this provoked riots in Scotland and finally a rebellion. The Scottish armies defeated the king's forces, and he started running out of money, and the only way he could raise money at this point was to call Parliament again. So he called Parliament in 1640. But the Parliament that gathered was determined to resist his tyranny and to try to force reformation on the English church. So Parliament began arresting, putting on trial, and even executing the king's advisors, including Archbishop Laud. Now in 1641, while this was going on, a rebellion broke out in Catholic Ireland. England had begun conquering Ireland about 100 years before, during the 1530s. And during the time of Elizabeth, England had ruthlessly crushed several Irish Catholic rebellions, even using the tool of famine to kill tens of thousands of Irish people. Well, now the Irish retaliated by murdering thousands of Protestants. So it was necessary for an English army to go and deal with Ireland, but Parliament didn't trust the king to lead an army anymore. So in 1642, civil war broke out in England between those loyal to Parliament and those loyal to the king. And the need to raise an army to crush the Irish rebellion was the spark that led to this English Civil War. But this was the moment the Puritans had long been waiting for, and the Puritans were extremely influential in Parliament. So Parliament dismantled the episcopal system in the Church of England. No more government by bishops. And in 1643, Parliament called a synod with representatives from England and Scotland with the task to reform the church. And if you're Presbyterian, this should be especially significant to you because this synod was known as the Westminster Assembly, because it met at Westminster in London, and it drafted the Westminster Confession of Faith, the major confession of Presbyterianism, and it also drafted the larger and shorter catechisms, which represented the latest, fullest stage of Reformed orthodoxy in all its maturity. They also drafted a directory of public worship, although it was never used as much or considered as authoritative as the Westminster Standards. The problem was, despite the Assembly's work, by this point serious fractures were appearing in the English Reformed movement. The majority of Puritans were Presbyterians, and they supported Presbyterian church government. But a significant and influential minority were Congregationalists or Independents, who believed that each congregation should be self-governing. They still believed in having pastors and elders, but they didn't believe in the authority of presbyteries or synods, or what in the CRC are called classes. And a growing number of Independents or Congregationalists, you could use those terms synonymously, were Baptists who now rejected infant baptism. And while Presbyterians dominated Parliament, the Congregationalists or Independents dominated the army, including its rising general, the zealous Oliver Cromwell, whose new model army was an elite force that was famous for marching into battle singing psalms. Without a new establishment of authority, the religious scene became chaotic. And so the Westminster reforms never really won the allegiance even of all the Puritans, even of all those who were sympathetic to the Reformed tradition. And because they were unable to really create order within the church, the whole system was increasingly fragmenting and becoming chaotic. And within the Congregational or Independent movement were increasingly radical groups, such as a group known as the Levelers, who believed that Christianity demanded radical social equality. And by the way, this is Oliver Cromwell. At the same time, many Puritans were flush with millennial hopes. They believed that they were on the verge of the 1,000-year reign prophesied in Revelation that would precede Christ's second coming. And there's an important shift going on here. In Calvin's day, many reformers had expected that all of Christian history before Christ's return would be characterized by suffering. But now a growing number of Puritans thought that actually things would get better and better, and Christ would establish a sort of earthly kingdom as like a prefigurement of his final ultimate kingdom. And they were so excited about this, they thought it was happening in England. And hundreds of Puritans who had gone to America even came back to England so that they could be part of it. And many put their hopes in Oliver Cromwell. The most radical of these millennialists were known as fifth monarchists. And the idea of the fifth monarchy comes from the book of Daniel, where you have the prophecy of the statue that represents 4 different kingdoms. And then the 5th kingdom is made without hands, and it comes and it smashes all the other kingdoms, and then it fills the earth. And that is supposed to be the kingdom of Christ. And fifth monarchists believed that Protestant England might be that kingdom prophesied in the book of Daniel. So there's increasing radicalization going on within the Puritan movement in the context of the English Civil War. Now, the English and Scots had been united in an alliance known as the Solemn League and Covenant. But the Scots proved willing to negotiate with King Charles, whereas the English Puritans, Parliament, were not. And so the Reformed cause fractured further when Parliament went to war with Scotland as well, and now you have English Reformed fighting Scottish Reformed. In 1648, Cromwell defeated the king, and he defeated the Scots. But with Parliament increasingly powerless to reform the church and establish order, Cromwell actually led a coup, and he purged Parliament of its Presbyterian majority. Those who remained were independents and Congregationalists. It was such a small number that this Parliament became known as the Rump Parliament, and it no longer represented the mass of the English people. But that didn't stop the Rump Parliament from putting King Charles on trial, accusing him of waging war against his own people. He was declared guilty, and in a stunning verdict in 1649, he was beheaded. And if you know your medieval history and your English history, you know how very rarely a king was beheaded. It was seen as an incredibly bold act, and many immediately questioned its validity. But as I've mentioned before, Reformed theologians and theorists had been working out a theory of resistance to tyranny for quite some time, and this was really an application of it, albeit one that was very radical. But a growing number of Reformed figures had come to believe that monarchy itself was illegitimate, and that it was time for England to become something like a republic. So again, I just note that here's a case where the Reformed tradition, Reformed theology, is increasingly associated with a political tradition that increasingly emphasizes liberty and is moving towards a Republican approach to government. So England was now a republic, and Cromwell became its Lord Protector. He refused offers to be king. He waged a brutal war against the Catholic Irish, killing them in large numbers and confiscating their land. And there's all sorts of notorious stories about Cromwell and his brutality. But on the other hand, amid a growing number of voices calling for religious toleration in England, including John Milton, Oliver Cromwell actually offered unprecedented religious liberty. He gave Catholics far more freedom than they had had under King Charles. In fact, he even welcomed Jews back to England. They had been banished from England in 1290, but he now welcomed them back in hopes that their conversion to Christianity would precede Christ's return and hasten the millennium. Another radical group that emerged at this time was the Quakers. The Quakers rejected the legitimacy of church and state alike. In that sense, they were similar to the Anabaptists, but they didn't come from the Anabaptist movement. But they rejected all earthly authority, insisting on radical equality between people, including men and women. And they emphasized the authority of Scripture, arguing that Christ appears to every single man and woman by an inner light. They permitted women to preach, and they boldly defied the authorities, refusing to take off their hats to them or to speak respectfully to them. And over time, they rejected oaths, and many ended up becoming pacifists. They would rudely interrupt ministers in church, and Quaker women were known to parade naked through town in a sort of prophetic exercise. So the Quakers were seen as a very antisocial and extremely radical group to come out of the English Civil War. Now, Cromwell repeatedly clashed with various parliaments, and gradually he established himself as what amounted to a military dictator. But in 1658 he died. His son proved unable to fill his shoes, and in a shocking reversal amid rising chaos, the English Parliament asked Charles II, the son of Charles I, to come back to England and reclaim the throne. And so Presbyterians and Puritans watched with horror as the Church of England, with its bishops and its liturgy, were rapidly re-established. The Puritan Commonwealth collapsed with stunning rapidity. And although the Church maintained the 39 Articles in the Book of Common Prayer from Elizabeth's time, it would never again be as reformed as it had been before the English Civil War. Now, after the restoration of Charles II, the Church of England began to look like what we might properly call Anglicanism, or the Anglican Church. Those who could not accept its move away from Reformed principles became known as dissenters. And about 3,000 such clergy, dissenting clergy, who were Puritan at heart, or otherwise, Baptists, Congregationalists, Presbyterians, Quakers, left the church. Now, the Church of England, the government of England after the Restoration, was more moderate than before. The tide was turning, and a growing number of people were calling for more religious toleration, and so it was no longer considered acceptable to execute people for religious reasons. But the government still persecuted dissenters in other ways, and it would not allow them to hold public office. Puritanism was shattered as a political force. It would never again become anywhere near as significant as a political movement as what it had been heading into the English Civil War. And the English Civil War marks the end of English Protestant unity. From this point forward, English Protestantism will be deeply fractured, and you begin to see the beginnings of the multiplication of what will become denominations that we now take for granted today. The 30 Years' War lasted until 1648, when it was ended by the Peace of Westphalia. This peace was significant because it came out of just sheer exhaustion. After 30 years of horrific war, people just wanted stability. And so it was agreed that all territories would have the religious status that they had had in 1624. Now, this meant that lands that were Protestant in 1624 could stay Protestant, but it also meant that everything the Catholics had conquered between 1618 and 1624, including Bohemia and the Austrian lands, would now be Catholic. In other words, the 30 Years' War had definitely set back the Protestant cause considerably. Many areas in Central and Eastern Europe that had had strong Protestant influence were now irreversibly Catholic. And also from this point forward, the fluidity among different Christian groups in Europe comes to an end. The religious map of Europe fossilized, and from this point forward, areas that were Lutheran or Reformed or Catholic would stay Lutheran or Reformed or Catholic into the long-term future. And whereas about half of Europe had been Protestant in 1600 before the 30 Years' War, after the 30 Years' War, that number had fallen to about a fifth, 20%. And so it's really important to recognize that the religious wars were utterly disastrous for Protestantism, and they were disastrous for Christianity in general. We'll talk more about their impact in terms of pushing people towards toleration later on. But for now, it's just important to recognize just the sheer disaster that insisting on religious uniformity, insisting on the confessional allegiance of one's country had led to in Europe. Now, there was one more religious war. When the Calvinist prince Georgi II Rákóczi of Transylvania invaded Poland in 1656 to seize its throne for Protestantism. This Calvinist prince considered himself a modern-day David, and he considered Transylvania the Israel of Christendom. But the campaign ended in catastrophe. Europe was exhausted. Skepticism toward Christianity was on the rise, and leaders were determined to find ways to stop fighting over religion.